Learn Japanese history.
We are your navigators, Taro and Hanako.
Welcome. You're diving into a really fascinating period of Japanese history with us today.
hmm
We're looking at how the early states started forming, especially around the Asuka region.
Yeah, think of this as your sort of inside track to understanding some major shifts, in power, in culture,
We'll be digging into the rise of some pretty influential families, these clans,
and how new ideas, especially from the continent, started coming in.
right, and how all that led to setting up some foundational principles that,
Mm.
well, really shaped Japan as we know it.
Exactly. We've got some powerful families pulling strings, some big political reforms.
And even Japan sort of dipping its toes into international relations. There's a lot to unpack.
Let's get started. So maybe we should begin with the Soga clan.
Okay, yeah, the Soga. They become really central, don't they?
They really do. Around 6th century or so, they start building up serious influence at the Yamato court. What's kind of interesting is their background. Well, some think they might have had connections to families who'd, immigrated from the Korean peninsula. They weren't necessarily part of the most ancient aristocracy from the get-go.
So how did they climb the ladder, so to speak? It wasn't just inherited status.
Not entirely, no. They were smart. They got involved in managing the imperial court's money, finances, and overseeing production. Really practical stuff.
Controlling the purse strings and the goods.
Exactly. They were likely using the skills of those naturalized families, the ones maybe with continental know-how. It shows how controlling resources, not just your family name, could really boost your political standing.
That makes sense. And location mattered too, right? They moved into Asuka.
Absolutely. Big strategic move. They established themselves in the Asuka region and started managing these imperial estates. They were called Miyake and Tatenokura.
So basically imperial land, but under Soga management.
Pretty much. That gave them a huge economic base and, political weight right there in that key area.
Okay, and then came the master stroke, tying themselves to the imperial family.
Yes. That was crucial. Soga no Ineme, a key figure he arranged for his daughters to become consorts of Emperor Kinmei.
Right. So his daughters marry the emperor.
Uh-huh. And this creates what's called sekhan, basically. The emperor's in-laws, the maternal relatives, suddenly have immense influence over the next generation of rulers.
So the Sogas now have a direct hand in shaping who might be next on the throne. That sounds like a recipe for conflict.
It definitely was. You have to remember, succession back then wasn't always straightforward, like father to son. Often it went brother to brother.
Ah, okay.
Right,
It would
right.
complicate things.
Hugely, especially now with the Soga having influence through two different empresses, Iname's daughters, they could back different candidates.
So lots of political maneuvering behind the scenes.
Intense maneuvering. It led to some serious succession struggles. And this brings us to Soga no Umako, Iname's son. Things got really dramatic with him.
How so?
Well, first, in 587, he defeats his main political rival, Mononobe no Moriya, in battle. Big power shift. And then, just a few years later, in 592, Emperor Sushuning is assassinated.
Assassinated. Wow. Were the Soga involved?
The historical accounts strongly suggest Umako was behind it. It really shows you the kind of high-stakes power plays happening.
Okay, so the emperor is assassinated. The Soga is basically running the show. What happens next? This sounds like chaos.
Well, amidst this instability, something pretty unprecedented happens. Empress Suko takes the throne.
An empress.
Uh,
A female ruler.
exactly. The first recorded reigning empress in Japan. It seems like putting the previous emperor's widow on the throne became a sort of strategy, maybe, for navigating these really tricky succession crises.
Interesting. A way to stabilize things when the male lines were in conflict.
Possibly, yeah. And it set a precedent for the future, too.
So during Empress Suko's reign, another major figure comes to prominence, doesn't he? Prince Shotoku.
Yes, Prince Shotoku. Though it's worth noting he was known as Prince Umaya, or Umaya no Miko at the time. The name Shotoku Toishi actually came much later, like in the 8th century.
Ah, good clarification. So Prince Umaya then, what was his role?
He served as regent, or sesho, for his aunt, Empress Suiko. And he worked very, very closely with Soga no Umako. They were kind of the ruling duo.
So the Soga influence is still massive, even with an empress and regent.
Oh, absolutely. And Asuka, where Empress Suiko had her palace, really becomes the heart of politics and culture. That's why we call this the Asuka period.
Right. And isn't there that huge stone tomb thing in Asuka, the Ishibutai?
Yes. And many believe it's actually the tomb of Soga no Umako. It just underlines the Soga dominance in that region.
Okay, so we have Suko, Umako, and Prince Umai Shotoku in charge. What do they actually do? You mentioned reforms earlier.
Right. Prince Shotoku, in particular, is credited with pushing through some really foundational political reforms. One of the big ones early on was the 12-level cap rank system in 603.
12-level cap ranks. Okay, break that down for us. What was the idea?
So it was a hierarchy, 12 ranks, each split into major and minor. Your rank was shown by the color and decoration of the cap you wore. But the really cool part is what they were based on. Not just birth, but 6 Confucian virtues. Things like benevolence, propriety, sincerity, righteousness, knowledge.
So, like, merit, based on your character and ability.
Kind of, yeah. It was a really groundbreaking idea for the time, trying to bring talented individuals into government service based on their qualities, not just their family name. It was a first step towards building a proper bureaucracy.
That sounds quite radical. Did it completely change things?
Well, probably not overnight. There were limitations. The imperial family itself, and crucially the Soga clan, were outside the system.
Ah, okay, so they were still above it.
Seems like it. And it probably mostly applied to the powerful families already near the capital, but still, conceptually, it was a huge shift valuing individual merit in government.
A significant first step, then. What came after the cap ranks?
The very next year, 604, saw the 17-article constitution.
A constitution. Like laws.
Not quite like a modern constitution. It was more a set of ethical guidelines, like a moral code for officials and the state.
Okay, what kind of principles did it lay out?
It focused a lot on the relationship between the ruler, the officials, and the people. You know, how officials should behave ethically, the importance of harmony.
Harmony sounds like a key theme.
Definitely. It stressed avoiding factionalism, listening to others, and significantly, it brought in Buddhist principles as a kind of fundamental basis for good governance.
So Buddhism is being woven into the political ideology now.
Yes, very clearly. But it wasn't just abstract ideals. There were also practical points reflecting the political realities, trying to keep the powerful clans working together under the ruler.
So cap ranks for structure, constitution for ethics. Were there other projects happening?
Yeah, another really important development was the start of compiling official histories. Records like the Tenoki, which was about the emperors, and the Kokuki, about the country itself.
Why was that important, creating a narrative?
Exactly. Establishing a history, a lineage, a sense of legitimacy for the ruling dynasty. And alongside this, we see the ruler's title starting to change.
How so?
From Okimi, which is roughly Great King, to Tenno.
Which means emperor.
Right. That shift suggests a move towards a more elevated, perhaps even divinely sanctioned, supreme authority for the ruler. It's a big step in shaping the idea of the Japanese emperor.
Okay, so internally, Japan is really starting to define its political structure and ideology. What's going on outside Japan at this time? With China, for instance.
Ah, yes, the wider context is crucial. China had just been reunified under the Sui dynasty in 589. That was a massive event in East Asia.
How did that affect the region?
Well, the Sui were powerful. The Korean kingdoms of Baekje and Silla quickly formed tributary relationships with them. Goguryeo, another Korean kingdom, resisted, and the Sui actually failed in trying to conquer them, which eventually weakened the Sui dynasty itself, but that's another story.
So a powerful, unified China nearby. How did Japan react?
They decided to engage directly. In 607, they sent an envoy, Ono no Imoko, to the Sui court.
Okay, establishing contact.
Yes, and the Sui responded. They sent their own envoy, Pei Shinching, to Japan in 608.
So diplomatic exchange.
Exactly. And when Pei Shiking went back, Ono no Imoko went with him on a second mission. But this time, he took a whole group of students and scholar monks. People like Takamuko no Maro, Min, Minabuchi no Shoin names that become important later.
What was the goal of sending all these people?
The main idea seems to have been to learn directly from China, their institutions, their culture, everything, but without necessarily going through Baekje on the Korean peninsula, which had often been the intermediary before.
Cutting out the middleman, so to speak.
Sort of, yeah. But what's really remarkable, and maybe a bit bold, was that Japan seemed to be trying to engage with Sui China as an equal, not as a subordinate or tributary state, but on level footing.
Really? Against the mighty Sui dynasty? That does sound bold.
It was. There's a famous story about the letter Japan sent, addressing the Sui emperor in terms that implied equality, which apparently annoyed him quite a bit.
Huh. I bet it did. Why take that risk? Why push for equality?
Well, one theory is that it was also about Japan's position relative to the Korean kingdoms, especially Silla. Silla had recently annexed the territory of Kaya in 562, which Japan had ties to.
Ah, so maybe Japan wanted to show China And Silla, that it was a major player in its own right, not just some island chain dependent on Korea.
That's likely part of it. Asserting its status on the regional stage. This proactive approach, learning directly from China but insisting on an equal relationship, was pretty important for how Japan developed its own distinct path later on.
So putting it all together, this Asuka period seems incredibly formative.
Absolutely. You've got this potent mix of internal power struggles, like with the Soga, alongside really conscious efforts at state-building the reforms under Suiko and Shotoku, and this new direct engagement with the continent. It really lays the groundwork for so much that follows.
The efforts of Empress Suiko, Prince Shotoku, even the ambitious Soga clan, they fundamentally reshaped things politically and culturally.
Definitely. A melting pot of ambition, new ideas, diplomacy.
So here's something to think about as we wrap up. When you consider these early interactions with China and the internal reforms like the cap ranks and the Constitution, which of these elements do you think ultimately had the most lasting impact on Japan's path forward over the centuries? Was it the bureaucratic structures, the ethical ideals, or that early assertion of diplomatic identity?
That's a great question to ponder. This deep dive really just scratches the surface of the Asuka period. It's not just about dates and names, it's about seeing how ambition, diplomacy, cultural borrowing, and the drive to create an identity all came together. We hope this has definitely sparked your curiosity to explore this fascinating era even more.